Okay, testing. Yep. Yeah, something, this, some warmth, don't you
Oh,
feel?
right down here, all the computer stuff's right here, and
Oh.
it's why it's so warm. It's very warm. Well, maybe if you stand, when you stand up. maybe-
No, it's fine. It's good.
Yeah, you know what you were saying. Or do you want a clicker? You want a clicker?
Oh, it won't work. Oh, yeah, it is. Okay. That's fine.
The lady that's walking in the right now, in the red shirt.
Mm-hmm.
Got here at 1 o'clock. She was expecting that. She got here early. She's back. I guess we'll get started. Good afternoon. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. If you have a cell phone, if you can please silence it, would be greatly appreciated. People on Zoom, you are muted. Please stay muted. At the end, questions and answers, I'll monitor the chat and you can put your questions in there. And we don't have a facilitator for this class, but everybody knows and loves Barbara Oberlander. So we're in for a good treat again. There you go, Barbara.
Good afternoon, everyone. And if this is too loud, yes, we can turn it down a little bit. How's that? Is that about right? Okay. Well, last week you heard about Mary Edwards Walker, the only woman to receive the Medal of Honor, who's on this special issue collection of American women on the quarters. And today I've chosen 2 other women. There are actually three Native American women who are on the quarters. And today I want to talk about 2 of them. Wilma Mankiller, who was the first female chief of the Cherokee Nation, and a woman named Zitkala Sa, which means red bird, who I had not a clue about. I was surprised to see her, and even more surprised and astonished to learn about her. So Wilma Mankiller, I think, was probably a name familiar to many of you. She had appeared on the cover of Time magazine. She had met with presidents. There was a lot of commentary about her. And there she is, far left quarter. Who was this remarkable woman who rose to become chief of the Cherokee Nation. The Mankiller family was from Oklahoma, and Wilma often joked about her name, saying she had earned that last name, Mankiller, but that wasn't the case. It was a tribal name, actually a military rank. She was born in 1945 in the Hastings Indian Hospital in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Her father, Charlie, was actually a full-blooded Cherokee whose ancestors had been forced to leave Tennessee on that very famous Trail of Tears that we can attribute to Andrew Jackson, where many of the tribes that lived in the South were forced to leave their ancestral lands and go west. So her family ended up in Oklahoma. Her mother was actually of Dutch, English, Irish descent. They had come originally to Virginia and then migrated to the West later. The family lived on the grandfather's allotment land. Now, American Indian policy, governmental policy, is probably one of the most confusing areas you've ever looked at. The government had different policies at different times. And one of the policies had been something called the Allotment Act, where Native Americans were convinced to move off of tribal reservations and take up individual plots of lands in order to become that American ideal of farmer. Now, much of the land that was given, of course, was the poorest land possible. And the family grew up in poverty. Here's a photograph of Wilma and her siblings. They grew a variety of crops, or tried to. They hunted, they fished, they had a vegetable garden, they grew peanuts, sometimes they attempted to grow strawberries. The family spoke both English and Cherokee, and her mother made Wilma dresses out of flour sacks. That was the beginning. And then in 1955, there was a terrible drought in Oklahoma, and the family, like many of the other Native American families, fell deeper into poverty. So the government changed policy again and said, give up the allotments, we'll move you to an urban environment, you'll be in a city, there'll be lots of job opportunities, you will flourish. And so the family in 1955 moved to San Francisco, and they were put up in a hotel in one of the worst districts in San Francisco, surrounded by crime and poverty. It was a very difficult period for Wilma. The family kept moving from San Francisco to other places in California. She went to different schools. She was laughed at because of her clothes, because of her accent, because of the way she spoke. Somehow, she managed to graduate from high school in 1963, and she was hired as a clerk for a financial agency. And there she met her first husband, who was a student from Ecuador. They were married in 1963. Here she is in San Francisco. And here she is with the two daughters from that first marriage, Felicia and Gina, at Felicia's high school graduation. Now, While she was in California, she returned to school. She'd never really been interested in school before, but she started taking classes in social sciences. And then there occurred one of those pivotal moments that changes a person forever. It was the occupation of Alcatraz. Perhaps some of you remember this. Alcatraz, of course, was no longer functioning. The island was no longer functioning as a prison, and it was essentially empty. A developer wanted to come in and build a mall. You know how that goes. A small group, about 90 American Indians who were part of a growing Indian rights movement, occupied Alcatraz. They went to the island, they put up signs, they said they were going to occupy it, and they wanted to buy it from the US government for $25, which is what the government had paid for Manhattan. So they created a storm of protest, a lot of publicity. This occupation lasted for slightly under 2 years. And Wilma went to Alcatraz, there she is on the right, and joined this occupation of the abandoned prison. And she began to talk to people who gave voice to what she was feeling about the mistreatment of Native Americans. So she was very active in this Alcatraz occupation. It was, as I said, a pivotal moment, a watershed experience for her. And when she came out from the occupation was finally ended when the government came onto the island and dragged people off. She enrolled in San Francisco State University, and she began to take classes in social welfare. She took her daughters to various Native American events, and she met members of a group called the Pitt River Tribe. They were attempting to get payment for land that had been illegally seized from them, and she worked with them for a while. She became good at investigating what was going on, and then she founded an East Oakland Native American Youth Center. She was the director, and more and more involved in Native American affairs, and becoming very good at all of this, at working with people and understanding what was going on and attempting to bring about changes. So she began to attract attention as she is working here. And as she attracted attention, she worked on something called the Bell, Oklahoma Water Project. She moved back from California to Oklahoma, and the Cherokees had established a community resource project, and she was the first, essentially, director of this resource project. This is important because it shows her approach. This water project is one in which she wanted the local people to be involved. In other words, they would lay the pipes themselves. They would build the buildings. They would put down the roads. And she was very interested in having local groups become involved in community projects as opposed to the government coming in and doing something for them, because she wanted to instill a sense of pride. So as she attracted attention, the chief of the Cherokee Nation, and it was called the Cherokee Nation, noticed her. His name was Ross Swimmer, and he asked her to run with him as deputy chief. Now, no woman had ever been deputy chief of the Cherokee before, and she agreed. They had different approaches to policy. He was a Republican, she was a Democrat. He wanted businesses, she wanted local community projects. They both wanted the Cherokee Nation to flourish. They had different approaches on how this should happen. But the main issue in this election was not economics. The main issue was gender. Surprisingly enough, because the Cherokees have a long matrilineal heritage, there was all this opposition to her simply because she was a woman. She had death threats. She had her tires slashed. She received threatening letters and notes simply because of her gender. Nonetheless, she persisted, and she won in a runoff election. So here she is, the first female deputy chief of the Cherokees. Of course, the tribal council was not helpful to her. She had many clashes with this tribal council, so she tried to go around them. And then here she is, being sworn in 1983. But in 1985, Ross Swimmer decided to take a job with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And suddenly, Wilma Mankiller was chief of the Cherokee Nation, the first female chief. And here she is being sworn in. The person holding the Bible is Charlie Soap, someone she had met. He worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he will become her second husband. Now, as chief, one of the first things that would happen would be that she would marry Charlie Soap. And there was controversy about that, although he was a full-blooded Cherokee. He urged her to keep running in her own right, and she did run in her own right and won again in a very close election, absentee ballots, a recount, and all of that. But she became now the first elected female chief of the Cherokee Nation. And she's now attracting all kinds of attention. She is being invited to speak at conferences. Her picture is on the cover of magazines. There's a lot of international interest in this woman. So what was she going to do? Well, Wilma Mankiller essentially was chief of the Cherokee Nation for a decade, from 1985 to 1995. And she had certain priorities. Here she is with Winterhawk, who was Charlie Soap's son. Now, the Cherokee Nation included 14 counties and 140,000 people. There are many more people of Cherokee descent, but they are not part of this group called the Cherokee Nation. They live outside of these boundaries. One of her first issues was job training. And you can see her here. There was something called the Talking Leaves Job Corps Center. The government was threatening to close it down. She wanted it maintained. She thought it was very, very important for young people to get job training. And so she tried to encourage partnerships between the government, private businesses, and Cherokees in order to generate economic growth and economic independence. She lobbied also for new health facilities, and I can't stress how important this was. When she became chief, the major clinic for Cherokees was a back room of a grocery store that was open a few days a week. And of course, health among Native Americans has been a long-standing issue. And she was insistent that there be better health facilities, that there be a freestanding clinic that was open all the time, that it be well-staffed, and that people have access. I would say that she was particularly sensitive to this because you're dealing with a woman who had a series of health challenges. She had been in a terrible automobile accident when she was in her 20s. She had, I think it's 17 surgeries resulting from that car accident. She inherited kidney disease, which ran through her family. She had, we will see, 2 kidney transplants. She had lymphoma. She had various kinds of cancer. She had a number of major health challenges. So she was particularly sensitive to the lack of good health facilities that existed. And she wanted to make sure that that was changed. And it was. This is a clinic named after her in Stillwell, Oklahoma. And I'm here to tell you that the Cherokee Nation has one of the best health programs of any of the Native American tribes in this country. And she constantly was working for Cherokee empowerment and independence. And here she is. This is 10 days after a kidney transplant. She's signing a Declaration of Independence from the Bureau of Indian Affairs while she was in a hospital in my hometown of Boston. And this was very important. This was 1990. And essentially, the Cherokees were given a major complement of self-government, which was essential. She met with President Bush. She found him very sympathetic as opposed to her former meeting with Ronald Reagan. And Bush listened to what she said about the changes that had to come. She was crucial in promoting an awareness of, an appreciation, and a pride in Cherokee heritage. And this is the Cherokee Heritage Center, which you can visit. In 1993, she published her autobiography talking about her life and Cherokee traditions. Wonderful picture of her for those 10 years. She received the Medal of Freedom from President Bill Clinton in 1998. She had supported his presidential campaign. Another view of her then. She was friendly with some of the major figures of the times, including Gloria Steinem. In fact, she spoke at various conferences on women's rights. Another picture of her with Gloria Steinem. When she stepped down as chief and she decided not to run again because of health issues, she lectured around the country, she toured, she did a stint as a visiting professor at Dartmouth, where they started a Native American Studies program. Traveled extensively. Time, of course, put her on the cover in 2020. This was several years after her death. And I think the subtitle is perfect, Revitalizing Native Communities. It really reflects what she had done. And of course, some of her marvelous quotes. Cows run away from the storm while the buffalo charges toward it and gets through it quicker. Whenever I'm confronted with a tough challenge, I do not prolong the torment. I become the buffalo. The secret of our success is that we never, never give up. And the photo of her against the background of Native American designs. She was given 14 honorary degrees. There were numerous awards about her. She left a permanent legacy through her efforts to build community structures within the Cherokee Nation, to empower them with community development, with pride in their heritage. Her projects, many of her projects still stand today. She emphasized and encouraged Native American self-determination. She improved federal and tribal relations, and she was a role model for many other Native American figures. The Cherokee Nation today, in many ways, is one of the most prosperous. It has a huge budget. It has many businesses. It has a hospital network. It has a sense of empowerment, partially due to Wilma Mankiller. I think she would be very pleased to see how they are flourishing today. A very interesting, accomplished woman who had a very hard road simply because of the existing prejudice against a woman being head of a major tribe. So that's Wilma Mankiller. And the other woman I want to talk about today is very, very different. Zitkala Sa. And I suspect that many of you have never, like me, heard of her, even by her English name, Gertrude Bonin. Zitkala Sa Zitkala Sa was born in 1876 on the Yankton Sioux Reservation in the Dakotas. Her father abandoned the family very early on, and she was raised by her mother. When she was just 8 years old, remember this is the 19th century, Quaker missionaries came to the reservation and offered to take children to a boarding school. And this is the boarding school, White's Indiana Manual Labor Institute in Wabash, Indiana. What was happening in the 19th century was that Indian youths were being taken from their families, from reservations, sent to a variety of boarding schools to, quote, assimilate them into American white society. This was a forcible removal. Families were shattered, and children were shorn not only of hair, but tradition. So at 8, Zikalasa, and that means red bird, was taken to this manual labor institute. She was given a new name, Gertrude Bonin, and her hair was cut, her braids were cut. Now, she would write about this later in essays that were published in American magazines, and the essays are really incredible reading. She talks about this. She was hiding under the bed so they couldn't find her. What caused them to stoop and look under the bed, I don't know. I remember being dragged out, though I resisted by kicking and scratching wildly. In spite of myself, I was carried downstairs and tied fast in a chair. I cried aloud, shaking my head all the while until I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck, and I heard them gnaw off one of my thick braids. Then I lost my spirit. Since that day I was taken from my mother, I have suffered extreme indignities. People stared at me. I had been tossed about in the air like a wooden puppet, and now my long hair was shingled like a coward's. In my anguish, I moaned for my mother, but no one came to comfort me. Not a soul reasoned quietly with me, as my own mother used to do. For now, I was only one of many little animals driven by a herder. That's Zikalasa recounting her experience at White's boarding school. Here are the photograph of the first students you can see. But Zikalasa was extremely talented musically. And not only did she learn English at White's boarding school, even though she left for a while and then came back, she became proficient in the violin. She was, by all accounts, a violin prodigy. And eventually, she ended up going to Earlham College in Indiana on a scholarship, and then, believe it or not, to the Boston Conservatory of Music, which is one of the finest music places in the country. She was pictured here with her violin in 1898. Now, the person who took this photograph was a very well-known portrait photographer. And it's interesting that she took portraits of Zikalasa. She, of course, let her hair grow back. Here she is in what we would call American, in quotes, dress. And here she is in native dress. And Zikalasa herself wrote that she was caught between two worlds. She was in Native American world, and her spirit was also in the world that she had been thrust into forcibly. So I think these photographs are really incredible because they show the two sides of this woman, which she will grapple with essentially her whole life. Now, in the late 1890s, she took a job at Carlisle Indian Industrial School. I suspect that some of you have heard about Carlisle Industrial School. It is very famous. It is considered one of the most foremost Indian boarding schools at this time, founded by Richard Henry Pratt, who said, quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man." In other words, kill the Indian culture and save what's left. And so they took all these photographs at this school of before and after people in Native American dress and then in non-American dress. Zitkala Sa taught here for 2 years. But what she saw reminded her of her own experiences as a young child. And she began to think about what this meant and to write about it very, very critically. So this is what she said. Gazing upon the Indian girls and boys bending over their books, the white visitors walked out of the schoolhouse well satisfied they were educating the children of the red man. But few have paused to question whether real life or long-lasting death lies beneath the semblance of civilization. She started to collect Sioux legends, and she published them in 1901. And this was the book, it was called Old Indian Legends. Quote, "I have tried to translate the native spirit of these tales, root and all, into the English language, since America in the last few centuries has acquired a second tongue." And she started to publish essays in very well-known magazines, including the Atlantic Monthly and Harper's. They would be put together later in a book called American Indian Stories. And these essays revealed the abuses, the cruelty, the hypocrisy of places like Carlisle Indian School. And when these articles came out, and they came out in 1901 and 1902, they created a sensation because Harper's and Atlantic were very, very well-known publications. So people interviewed her. And here is an interview, Zitkala Sa, the Red Bird of the Sioux. It appeared in the Evening Star newspaper. Now, she had met another person who had survived an Indian boarding school and married him, and he became active in various reservations. So they moved, Raymond Bonin was his name, they moved essentially to Utah for several years, where he was assigned to be superintendent of some Indian reservations there. And while she was in Utah and her husband was associated with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, she became convinced that the Bureau of Indian Affairs treated the native peoples with prejudice, corruption, and hypocrisy. The Bureau of Indian Affairs left Native Americans without power to make choices, and she felt it had to be changed. In 1911, she joined something called the Society of American Indians. This was a group working to bring back various Indian prerogatives and rights. And then they moved to Washington, and she became active in the women's suffrage movement. Here she is at the National Women's Party in Washington, D.C. After women got the vote in 1920, she asked women who had the vote to work for full citizenship for Native Americans. It might surprise you, but most Native Americans were not considered citizens of the United States and therefore did not have the right to vote. People who had joined the military became citizens. People who married someone who was already a citizen became citizens. But there were hundreds and thousands of Native Americans who were left out. And Zitkala-Sa pushed for a Citizenship Act that would give Native Americans full citizenship and political power. And that finally came in 1924. Here she is in 1921. And this. While she was in Washington, she became a researcher for the Indian Rights Association, went back to Oklahoma, traveled around the state, and came out with a report in 1924. I hope you can read the subtitle. Oklahoma's Poor Rich Indians, an orgy of graft, exploitation of the 5 civilized tribes, legalized robbery. This is a 39-page report that's filled with her fury on every single page. She has detailed descriptions, painful, of the way in which Indian land was stolen, seized, Indian women were abused. It was a scathing report. One of the things that had happened under the Allotment Act, where land was given to Native Americans, was that guardians were supposed to be appointed to make sure that everything was okay. Well, these guardians in Oklahoma had systematically seized and taken Native American land for themselves. And of course, once oil was discovered, you all know what happens. There's murder, there's robbery, there's legal shenanigans. Oh, this report was incredible. There's no doubt about it. And it led to a congressional commission looking at what was happening in Oklahoma. She and her husband, Raymond, founded something called the National Council of American Indians in 1926, and this was to work for the empowerment of Native Americans. And it wasn't just political empowerment. It was cultural empowerment. In 1913, she collaborated with a music professor from Brigham Young University and wrote an opera. It was an opera based on the sun dance, a Native American ritual that was at that time outlawed. What she was trying to do in this opera was give people an appreciation of culture and also raise a traditional tribal practice to the level of grand opera. Now look at the headline. Indian girl writes opera. It's 1913. She's in her 40s, and they're calling her an Indian girl. This opera was produced all over Utah several times, many times. It received a lot of praise, and it had its New York premiere, unfortunately, 3 months after she died. This is a clipping from the Salt Lake City, Utah newspaper, and there she is pictured with Professor Hansen, who was her collaborator. One of the interesting things about this opera when it was produced in New York, if you look at the libretto, the opera is by Hansen. Her name is absent. She's not even mentioned. She died in 1938, but her influence lives on. There's no doubt about it. You know, when you compare Wilma Mankiller and Zikala Sa, they both experienced the tragedy of American Indian policy. They both had childhood experiences that were traumatic, that shaped them for the rest of their lives. And they were both activists. They were activists in the political sense. They were activists in terms of cultural empowerment. And they leave a lasting legacy. Indeed, they belong on Women on the Quarters. Two remarkable women. So, thank you for listening, and I'm happy to have any questions. Questions, comments? What happened to the opera? I haven't heard that it's been performed at all recently. You can still see it. I mean, you can still see the libretto and the music and all of that, but I don't think there was any effort after 1938, unfortunately.
Questions? Anybody have any questions? Okay.
From your talk, it appears that the Water Resource Project really brought Mankiller to. Okay, from your talk, it appears that that Water Resource Project really brought Mankiller to prominence. I mean, it was right after that that she was asked to run as deputy chief.
Yes.
What exactly was that? What did she do?
It was a project to bring essentially running water, good water, as opposed to a well, to bring water to a local community that many people could have access to. So they had to lay the individual pipes so that there would be faucets. And it was considered a major achievement, partially because she insisted that the whole community become involved. laying the pipes, building the facilities that house them. So yes, that was one of her major projects, was the Bell Water River project.
And by insisting that the community had to participate in building it, she gave them a sense of ownership, where if it had been built by the government, they could have trashed it, rejected it. But my input is that about 4 years ago, I had the privilege of being in Dawson City, Yukon, way up there. This is North Canada. And I was so impressed with the presence of the indigenous people in that town, that city, small city. It was a mining town for, centuries. But they dressed in their costume, more or less, what we think of as costume. And they had a headquarters in that city. And they were present throughout. I mean, bringing their children into the restaurant, and it was so different than our experience here, or my experience, I should say, as a traveler around the country and not seeing that kind of presence in towns that are actually within on the border of reservations. And yet we read of controversy about the Canadian schools in the 1800s, early 1900s, as they were here. Can you, I don't suppose you become an expert necessarily, but can you sort of explicate that difference? Can you explain, do you have any sense of why what we see now, or what I saw now in India and Canada, in terms of the situation of the Indians and the situation of the Indians in America on their reservations, in which they live apparently in poverty most of the time?
Yeah, Phyllis, there's a great variation. There's a tremendous variation. You have a number of reservations still. You have people living off the reservation, and there's a huge variation. And I will say that the Canadian government has been very good at trying to atone for past policies. They've issued a formal apology in terms of the boarding schools. We are still discovering graves at Indian boarding schools that everybody wanted to hide. So there's a huge variation. I just think that our government has had twists and turns in terms of Indian policy, and we've had a very difficult time really coming up with the best possible solution to the problems we have created. If you were keeping up with what happened during COVID, the deaths in Native American communities were higher than the average deaths in general American communities. There were major problems getting health care to some of the isolated communities. And of course, the issue of the lifespan. I haven't looked at it recently, but the lifespan for Native Americans, the average lifespan was way less than that it is for the rest of us. So there's just a huge variation. I don't have a good answer as to why the American situation is different, but I can tell you, when I tried to understand the maze of American Indian policies, I needed to reach for the Excedrin bottle. It is so confusing and it's like a maze. It is like a maze. We decided at one time everybody should be on reservations. Then we decided no, off the reservations, to the allotment policies, move people off the reservations, give them land. No, that wasn't successful. Move them to the cities, move them back to the reservations, give the reservations some power, take away the power, give them citizenship, but they can't vote in certain elections. It's unbelievably confusing, and it depends on which government is in power in our country, which political party, and how they see things. President Roosevelt got rid of the allotment policy, and he actually cited Zitkala Shah as one of the influences in terms of the 1930s policy, but the 1930s policy was changed later. So I don't have a good answer for that, but there are very strong Native American rights groups. If you go online, the Cherokee Nation has a website, and they will give you statistics, and they will tell you what they're doing in terms of economics. They are the largest single tribe in the country. The Sioux are about 5 or 6 down. But the population certainly has increased from where it was. So
Thank you so much, Barbara. I was wondering, like the Iroquois Nation, I believe they had a very matriarchal society. I was wondering if there were any other women Indian chiefs, perhaps in past times. And then also, I guess one thing that's very upsetting now is the problem of the numbers, great numbers of young Indigenous women that are just disappearing, and they're being trafficked, and many times and this, I think both Canada and in the US, and nobody seems to know what's happening.
yeah, that is a problem, the number of Indigenous women that have disappeared, not only here, particularly in Alaska and also in Canada. And we don't know the answer to that, really. There have been some books written about Native American women who've come to cities and been taken advantage of and fallen into prostitution and been abused. But that's not the whole answer as to why there have been so many people who essentially have disappeared. No. I can't really hear you. No, no. I mean, well, women as wise women, councils, but not the same kind of position that Wilma Mankiller had. Ellen,
Who picked these 12 women to be on these coins?
it was a project of the U.S. Mint, the Smithsonian Women's History Project, the National Women's History Museum, and then they took nominations from the floor. In other words, people could nominate. But it's a very interesting question you ask, because I've gone on the site many times trying to find out, who was nominated, how big the pool was, and how they cut it down. So I don't know. I haven't been able to find that. It's probably in a government document that's being shredded. But I will tell you that the woman who is the subject next week, Polly Murray, is so radical that I don't think she would be chosen today. She's absolutely one of the most radical women you will meet, not only because she was a civil rights activist before there was a civil rights movement, but because she is a woman who called out the President of the United States directly because of his failure in terms of racial policy. And it takes a very radical, bold woman to do that. And she did it in the 1930s, as you will see. She wrote directly to Roosevelt and called him out publicly because of his policy. And so she is, I think, stands out on those coins. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt is one of them, Sally Ride, Maya Angelou, I mean, people you know. But Polly Murray, I want to know how she was chosen, and I can't find it. So if any of you can find it, please let me know. It's just not available. Yes, ma'am.
Wait just a second. We have somebody on Zoom. Emily?
Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Emily.
I want to congratulate you on another wonderful presentation. I just had a couple of comments. I've been to some presentations given by, I will refer to them as Native Americans. And the one that he made a couple of points. They don't agree on how they like to be referred to. Some like First Nations, some like Indians, some like Native Americans. There is no agreement on what they like to be called. However, they do find it demeaning to call their clothing, their traditional clothing, a costume. It is not a costume. It is called a regalia. They are not pretending to be something they are not. This is their regalia.
Thank you for that comment. Yes, I know Mets, in terms of how we refer to them, many of them like to be known as indigenous peoples. I found both terms, and everything I read, I just adopted Native Americans, but some people do not like that. They want to be called First Peoples or indigenous peoples. But regalia, I do like that. I like that term. Yes.
My daughter, she lives in Idaho, in Salmon, Idaho. And I still have a coin at home from Sacagawea. I don't know if I pronounce it right.
Yeah,
you-
Sacagawea. Yes.
Did I
but
say it
that-
right? Anyway, that's quite a history too of that Indian maiden.
Yes, yes. That's an earlier coin. The coin dedicated to Sacagawea is an earlier coin. It's not part of this quarters program. So I think that's probably one of the reasons they didn't choose her, because there already had been a coin in honor of Sacagawea. Yeah. Otherwise, I think she would have been one for sure.
One of the hot books out right now is that Killers of the Flower Moon. which
Yes, yes,
Explains all the abuses of that particular tribe.
yes.
Amazing. That I recommend it.
Yeah, The Killers of the Flower Moon was also a movie and based on the book. And of course, it's all true. And it fits in very much with her report. That's exactly what she was reporting. I mean, that report, the fire comes off the pages. She was so appalled by what she saw and so furious, and rightly so. You know, she called it murder, and it was. And it wasn't just the Cherokee, it was the Creek and the Choctaw, it was all the tribes in Oklahoma that she researched. So
Any other questions?
Thank-
Thank you so much, Barbara.
thank
We
you
enjoyed
for
it.
listening.